Welcome to Early Adopter, the podcast where we help make AI your unfair advantage. I'm Jess, a marketing exec, chief jargon buster, and I help ground AI in your practical day-to-day.
And I'm Kyle. I live at the intersection of data, product, and strategy, and I do my best to turn the technical AI chaos into something you can actually use.
We go beyond the overhyped headlines and give you the unvarnished truth about AI, what's real, what's hype, and what actually matters for your business.
Every week, we simplify the complex, spotlight the risks, and give you practical tools to make smarter decisions as the landscape rapidly shifts around us.
From agents to commerce to prompt engineering and vibe coding, we deliver honest insights, actionable strategies, and zero gatekeeping.
Let's dive in.
This is Early Adopter. Welcome to Early Adopter, the podcast where we help make AI your unfair advantage. I'm Jess.
I'm Kyle. So, Jess, tell me about your week. It sounds like you've had quite the roller coaster today.
Yeah, I'm actually not even going to talk about my week. It's mostly just been today. I had a haircut appointment and down in Chelsea, and it was a really nice day today. So I was like, oh, I'm gonna go for a little walk before, and I'll like walk down to Ladbroke Grove station and then just jump on the tube there because there are stations that are closer for me. But it was a nice day. I thought I'd go for a little walk. So I walked to Ladbroke Grove and realized it was closed for engineering works. So then I walked to Notting Hill and got on the tube and got about 3 stops before the train broke. So then I had to get off the train and walk all the way across from, if you know London at all, which you do, Lancaster Gate, which is like down by Marble Arch, all the way to South Kensington and not even to South Kensington, down to Chelsea, like past South Ken station. Yeah. So I ended up walking. I was just going to do I don't even know what I was going to do, but I ended up walking about twice what I had anticipated today.
Did you at least walk through the park and have like a nice little jaunt through it?
Well, no, I walked through the park, but I was rushing because at that point I had it was about a 35-minute walk and I had about 37 minutes to get to my appointment. So I was just like booking it through the park. And so I walked. I mean, it's never a bad thing to walk more than you think you're going to, but it just added on quite a bit of, and so then I ended up having to, which I never do this, but I ended up getting an Uber home just because I knew it was going to take me ages to get back. So anyway,
we had to record the pod.
Well, exactly. Priorities. That's why I was rushing to get back because I know you have to leave by a certain time. So anyway, it was all good, but it just meant that I walked far more than I anticipated walking today.
Just good exercise, Jess.
Good exercise. Yeah, I don't know if my feet agree with that, but we'll say it's good exercise. Anyway, how was?
Yeah, exactly.
How was your whatever?
Yeah, week good. Dine LA is in full swing, so went to a nice, cool, jazz club restaurant last night.
Nice.
The reason we're rushing today is I'm going to see the Two Towers Extended Edition in, I think it's in IMAX or Dolby or something, but, big screen in the theater. So me and my buddy Schwartz
Lord of the Rings for anyone who didn't get that. Yeah. Not everyone is a nerd like
one of my favorite movies of all time. And the Two Towers is the best one in the trilogy.
Agree. I saw that one in theaters so many times.
The Battle of Helm's Deep, just a cinema masterpiece.
I know.
But then also, I don't know if you'll notice, Jess, I'm wearing my Rams t-shirt. I'm already building the good vibes. We got a big game tomorrow against your Seattle Seahawks.
Boo! Down with Rams. Go Seahawks.
Good. I feel like you jinx Seattle sports. So if you're rooting for them,
I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to say anything. I did. My friend actually reminded me yesterday. I heard this somewhere. I cannot remember where I heard it. So I apologize to whoever I am stealing this from, but I once heard the Seahawks referred to, you'll like this, I heard them referred to as the Rain City bitch pigeons.
I love that. I'm going to use that.
I thought you might like that.
Sorry to all you Seattle folks out there.
It did make me laugh. Rain City bitch pigeons.
Well, my sister is a Niners fan and I'm a Rams fan.
Yes,
so we both have no love for Seattle, the Seahawks. So this is great. Lindsay, if you're out there listening, I know you just did a little woohoo. So that's exciting.
Yes. Well,
anyway.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. There's our sports talk done for the day. That's about the extent of sports talk you'll get out of me.
I'm going to say, look for our sports podcast to launch next week.
Go sports ball. Okay. So this week, we are going to be talking about synthetic data, which is actually something that I've been wanting to talk about for ages. You know, I've had this on our list for a really long time, so I'm glad that we're finally getting around to it. There's a little bit of background on this one, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do this is there's a marketing guru here in the UK called Mark Ritson. He's the founder of something called the Mini MBA in marketing. He is one of the most well-respected and he's just been around for a million years, and he's like one of the big marketing voices. He published a column a while back. He is very into synthetic data, and we'll get more into that later. But he is actually one of the first people that I heard talk about this. So he wrote a column probably at some point last year saying the era of synthetic data is upon us, and basically implied that it's bad news for traditional market research, which if you've ever done anything in the marketing space, you know that that is a very expensive nightmare.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very expensive for not a lot of recipients, right? So
Yes.
like usually it's like 1,000 or 1,500 person sample size. So that always surprised me. And also just a quick aside, since doing all this research about synthetic data, I am getting so many ads about synthetic data and synthetic data tools.
That is
so
nuts.
Yeah, there's a lot out there. But
yeah.
What Mark is talking about is that you can generate fake customers, ask them survey questions, and get results that match real human surveys with around 95% confidence. So cheaper, faster, no survey fatigue, which sounds great, right? But when you dig into it, the actual story is a little less clear-cut than that headline. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance and it's a little more complicated, as all things are, right?
Always. And honestly, people aren't even using the term synthetic data correctly as well, or not even correctly, but the same way. So it sounds like one thing, but there's actually a couple of completely different definitions of what that actually means. So we'll get more into that.
You're guaranteed confusion and bad decisions in that circumstance.
Exactly. So today we are going to focus on what synthetic data is, what the correct definition of it is, where it works, where it breaks, and what our audience of founders and small business owners can actually do with it. Next week, we've got our friend Lee Henshaw, who runs a course on marketing and AI, coming in to talk about this, and we'll go much deeper on everything. But today is just going to be some more background and a higher level overview of what it is. So today is the foundation.
And kudos to Lee. He was actually the first person that I heard talk about this.
Well, it was one of the reasons why Lee and I bonded, because we actually both did the Mark Ritson course a couple of years ago. I think he was like one cohort before I was. So we heard Mark bang on about this a lot. But actually, I will say there is someone I know in the film space who used synthetic. This is the first time I heard about synthetic data, was when I was still in the film space, and he was telling me that they use synthetic data to help them model box office post-COVID, when obviously it was really difficult to know what box office was going to look like. And so he helped them, synthetic data helped them model what that was going to look like. And it was really accurate and really, really, really beneficial. And that movie actually did crazy numbers. So, and to the point where the director actually name checked the data team in an interview, because I know, right? Like, when does a director ever talk about the studio's data team?
When do data teams ever get referenced?
Exactly, right? That's how important this modeling was to the movie, was that it was enough that it actually moved the needle. So that was the thing that got me particularly interested in it to begin with. So there you go.
And a project back in the day for me is I actually tried to model box office using all these like digital footprint things, and it is very difficult.
It is
so
very
that's
difficult.
impressive.
Yeah, it really is.
That is very impressive.
Okay, so synthetic data. Everyone is throwing this term around like it's one obvious thing, and as we've just discussed, it's not. The simplest definition is that it is artificially generated data that is designed to behave like real data. So it's built to mimic patterns that you would actually see in the real world, which is where something like modeling box office data can be really beneficial.
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to think of this is like a flight simulator. You're in the simulator, it behaves like a real plane, you can fly it around, but obviously you're not in a real plane and you're not potentially going to crash.
I feel like that's actually the whole episode right here. It's like very useful in the right context, but a total disaster.
It's also worth flagging that there are two completely different definitions, and maybe even there's a couple floating around, but we're going to focus on two for the synthetic data, because I think this is where it can get confusing.
So the first definition is synthetic datasets. So this is more on the technical side. So you can generate fake data that mimics real data for privacy or security or testing. So that could be like fake customer records or transaction histories. So you generate data that looks real and behaves statistically like real data, but nobody's actual information is there. And I believe this is what they did in this movie studio example.
Yeah. So if you're building a product and you need to test it against a realistic customer database, but you absolutely should not be using real customer data in a test environment, like with PII or something like that, personally identifiable information, most people think that's actually total fine use of this type of data. So if your test data gets leaked, it's really not a disaster because it's not real people.
But the second definition is where it starts to get a little less clear, and that is synthetic people or synthetic respondents. So that is where you're basically simulating customers and asking them survey questions. So you can tell there's quite a big difference between a synthetic data set versus synthetic respondents.
In practice, synthetic respondents are usually an AI model that's been trained or heavily conditioned on massive amounts of prior human data. So you give it a persona and context, and it generates the most likely answer based on patterns it's seen before.
It's less of a fake human and more of a probabilistic mirror of what people like that have historically said. So you need to make it really clear that it is based on real data, and it's what this data believes that someone would respond like. So there is a little bit of a key differentiation.
Yeah, and that differentiator is where synthetic data starts. So because one is I need fake data to test my product or train or something like that, and the other is I need to know what my customer thinks about my product.
Yeah. So there's a litmus test that we would suggest for this. Are you using synthetic data to test systems or to predict people? If it's systems, then synthetic data is usually safe. If it's people, you'll need to impose some guardrails, which we'll talk more about.
Yeah, and another separate definition that I don't think we're going to really focus on today, but I've heard bandied around is there's a third one called synthetic content. So this is your AI generated ads, images, product descriptions. That's not really synthetic data in the research sense. It matters, but it's a totally different category.
Before we get into all of this a little bit more deeply, let's talk about the obvious question, which is why now? Why is this suddenly everywhere now?
A few things are converging at once. First is that real data is harder to use safely these days.
Yeah.
So obviously there's privacy regulations like GDPR, there's security concerns, and companies are just a little more nervous about sharing customer data internally as well, let alone, obviously you don't want to be sharing things externally.
Yeah. So if you're a founder, it's actually a really practical use case from can I let my team test and experiment without using customer data or in a privacy safe way. And actually, even regulators think that this is a smart way to do it. The UK Financial Conduct Authority actually calls synthetic data a privacy-enhancing approach that can support safer data sharing. So it's regulator approved in that use case.
And the second reason why this is suddenly a thing is speed.
Yeah.
So if your decision cycles are daily or weekly, traditional research just can't really keep up with that. We alluded to it, but traditional market research takes months because you have to get people in and talk to them. And quite frankly, it's difficult to get people to answer surveys these days.
And extremely expensive. It is so expensive to run a big survey like that.
It takes weeks to run a survey and get people and motivate them. It then takes weeks to analyze it and understand it. So by the time you have the results, the market's moved on, or that decision you were trying to make is maybe outdated.
And the final reason is that people are actually just exhausted by surveys. Conversion rates on surveys are terrible and often skewed because a lot of the times people will only take a survey if they have a bad experience and they want to make that bad experience known. So it's actually really an unbalanced approach. And in the B2B space, which I know is probably where a lot of our audience sits, it's actually even worse. Some audiences are basically impossible to reach at scale. So synthetic data on paper looks like it solves this problem because it's fast, it's cheap, and you can reach anyone. So it's understandable why people would be excited about this as an opportunity.
Also, I think marketing measurement has gotten harder
It's
between cookie
impossible.
loss. Yeah. The loss of cookies, platform, walled gardens, obviously our big platforms are keeping all their data to themselves.
Yeah.
Attribution is getting really difficult. I mean, we've talked about with the LLMs, it's really difficult to find attribution there and measure that. So just generally, I think marketing teams are really hungry for any way to model customer behavior.
So now that we've laid the groundwork about what it actually is, let's talk about where it's already working, because this is important context. It's not just a marketing thing. There are other verticals and teams that are using it. So we've obviously been talking about Mark Ritson on the marketing side of things. As we mentioned, our guest next week, Lee, is in the marketing space. So it is obviously a very marketing intensive use, but there are lots of other aspects to a business that are using this as well.
Yeah. A really obvious use case that's not really marketing related is, autonomous systems.
Yep.
It's a great example, right? So think about training a self-driving car. You can generate synthetic training data through simulation to cover lots of different dangerous or rare situations that maybe you haven't quite seen before, or, you don't want to put people through. So, you can basically generate a lot of interesting simulations to help your overall training set without, trying to collect that data in real life.
Yeah, exactly. You don't really want to be sitting there hoping that a car accident happens in a horrific way so you can train your model on it.
Yeah.
It means that you can simulate thousands of edge cases in software. So NVIDIA actually frames this as capturing rare scenarios and situations that would take years to collect naturally. So that is one use case that you may not have considered.
Finance is another great example. So fraud patterns change constantly and data sharing is super restricted. So synthetic data helps banks test models and share insights across their teams while limiting exposure of real customer data. What we mean by super restricted is you can't really use much of that data because it's data ownership by individual people. So this is detecting fraud patterns is a really great one because you just don't have access to a lot of data, but you do need to be really careful about that.
Yeah. So when you get a text from your bank saying, hey, we noticed suspicious activity, that pattern would have come from synthetic data. So in both of those cases, with autonomous vehicles and finance, you are using synthetic data as a safer way to test in development. It's not your source of truth about how humans think. The synthetic data sets are basically, I need realistic data that behaves like reality, but without that privacy and security and safety in the example of autonomous vehicles. You don't need those headaches.
Yeah. And then obviously the marketing version of synthetic data sets, not the synthetic respondents, but the synthetic data sets. So you can create realistic customer journeys. So site visits, email opens, purchases or purchase journeys without exposing any real user level data. And that's going to help teams test analytics, test pipelines, dashboards. You can really try to better understand your customer behavior and your customer journey.
Yeah, actually, one of the resources that I found for this particular episode was actually MailChimp, because MailChimp have a whole thing about synthetic data. So it really is everywhere. It's also useful for rare events too, like churn or enterprise upgrades, because those events are infrequent, but from a strategic perspective, they're really, really, really important and huge. So you can model those as well.
Yeah, the churn one is really interesting, right? I mean, that's the holy grail of B2B SaaS.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my God. And actually, not even just B2B, from B2C, Okay, so the second definition that we talked about, the synthetic people or the synthetic respondents, is a whole nother beast. That is where we are asking synthetic people to tell us what real people think, and that is where it gets a little less black and white. Before we get into this, let's just pause on this synthetic respondents use case, because really this is one of the reasons why people are actually very excited about this, by this concept. Why are people, and by people I mean marketers, why are they actually excited about synthetic respondents?
Yeah, two big reasons. We've kind of touched on it a little bit, but it's the speed and cost as well. So simulating a target audience quickly, you can test messaging, concepts, exception handling, positioning. I mean, positioning, right? That's just so complicated.
Yep.
And you don't have to wait weeks for those survey results to come in. Obviously, we talked about you don't have to pay for a full research project, which can be very expensive and a lot of consulting time.
And founders, as I'm sure many in our audience can attest to, are addicted to fast feedback loops. So anything that shortens the distance between the idea and the reaction is going to feel incredibly compelling.
And then there's the hard to reach audience problem. So there's a real case study that illustrates this really well. A synthetic data provider ran a head-to-head test with EY, or Ernst & Young, the global professional services firm. using questions from a leadership survey they had just fielded with actual executives.
So it's the same questions and the same structure, just one answered by the actual leadership team and one version answered by synthetic respondents. And when EY compared the results, they found about a 95% correlation between the real survey and the synthetic one. So that's where that 95% number is coming from.
95% confidence is really strong when you're talking about marketing surveys or data. So especially on like straightforward, high-level questions. But one reason I think you can get that high correlation is that lots of survey questions are broad and socially normal. So if you ask executives high-level beliefs like, does innovation matter? We say like, you're going to cluster, right? Everyone's going to say the same thing. So the model can match that because the question itself is predictable. But that, we'll talk about this later, which is that really all that useful?
I mean, of course you're going to get a leadership team saying
I want to hear the executive who says no. Like, I want to talk to that guy because that's interesting.
Exactly. So that's a really big thing to be aware of, is that the headline number can still be real and sound impressive, but it still doesn't mean that it can actually replace research.
Yeah. But this is that moment where you understand the appeal. If you're a founder or a marketing professional, you hear that and think, okay, I can get something that's directionally correct very quickly, very cheaply, and, without the headache of chasing people or working with a really large firm, all of that.
Yeah. So it's not perfect, but it's clearly better than nothing, especially if the alternative is no research at all, which definitely not recommended.
Yeah. And we'll talk about the pitfalls, because obviously there was a executive survey that EY had run to base the data off of. So we'll talk about how you need that basis. But this isn't hype for no reason. The tool does really unlock speed and access in ways that weren't really possible before. And obviously, as we talk about, within the podcast a lot, this democratizes access to very specific personas that might be really difficult or expensive for you to get to typically.
We've played around with synthetic respond, where we were just trying to get some vague direction on a webinar.
Podcast.
Yeah, well, on the podcast, but also just on a webinar. And I would say it was enlightening is probably the right word for it. So this is actually where Mark Ritson comes back in, because he's obviously, as we've discussed, kind of the flagship voice who's really pushing synthetic respondents. His argument is basically synthetic data is as good as real. And then once you have that, then comes synthetic strategy.
And he references that EY case study. So when you hear that number, you immediately think, why would I ever pay for research again?
Exactly. And that is his point. But there is some important context to add to this, and he will talk about this himself, so it's not like we're trying to out him or something. Mark is actually linked commercially to a synthetic research company. He's an advisor and a shareholder in a company called Evidenza, which is one of the companies that is building this technology. So it doesn't automatically make him wrong, but it's just something you need to keep in the back of your mind when you hear him talk about this. Now, as I understand it, he is involved with that company because he believes in it so strongly. He is, having taken his course, he is definitely a proponent of market research. He knows how important it is for any business. So that is why he's involved with it. But it's just because if you Google synthetic data, Mark is probably going to come up. So it's just something to bear in mind when you hear him talk about it.
Yeah. But we're going to get into the downsides here. So I think one thing that founders should clock is that synthetic respondent tools are rewarded when their output feels decisive. Nobody gets paid, not even Mark, for saying you need to go talk to real customers.
So that's the upside to synthetic data. We've talked about the speed and the cost, and it's good from a directional perspective. But the big thing to remember is even when the numbers look very similar to real surveys, similar doesn't always mean right, or doesn't automatically mean right. So just something to bear in mind.
Yeah. And just like our, innovation is important example, it doesn't always mean useful. So risk number one that we want to talk about for everyone is bias in and bias out. So if the underlying patterns in your training data are biased, which they almost always are, and obviously we've talked about bias a lot with LLMs, same thing applies here. The synthetic output is going to inherit or have a lot of that bias. Yeah. So you're not starting fresh whenever you're doing this. You're amplifying what was already there.
And a quick nuance that we need to flag as well is that synthetic data can be privacy enhancing, but it's not automatically privacy safe. So also something that's really important to be aware of. If a model is trained badly, it can memorize rare records, or it can reproduce something that's too close to the original. So that is why governance is really, really important.
Yeah. And that's not necessarily obvious. You can't just look at it and go, there's the bias, or let me remove the bias or something like that, right?
Yeah.
You have to really, really look for it specifically. And it's difficult to do. So most people don't know how. Risk number 2 is false confidence, which I think is actually maybe the bigger threat. So synthetic answers often sound really smooth and coherent, like a well-briefed focus group participant would, but that's the problem.
I mean, this is the recurring problem with LLMs in
Hmm.
general, is that they're trained to answer in a way that you want to hear, right?
Yeah.
So if someone asked a synthetic respondent, do you drink alcohol in the morning? It could say yes with this whole logical explanation and that sort of thing. And a real person would just say, no, don't be crazy and move on. But because it sounds reasonable, because it's got this
Hmm.
whole like
Hmm.
background to it, then it makes it more believable.
Although I will say that's almost no different than like the loudest person in the room problem, where
Well,
you get
that
some of
is
the
a very
most
good point.
overconfident
That's a very
people
good point.
saying things that are baseless. But anyway, so yeah,
Very true.
always use your sound judgment. But the interesting thing about that example, Jess, is it's hallucinating coherently.
Yeah.
So that's not great for decision making. But risk number 3, synthetic respondents often regress to the mean. So they give you the most likely answer. But strategy, especially early stage strategy, often hinges on outliers or seeing things that are unique or different in the market. And that comes from industry experience or, subcultures, edge use cases, the weird reasons or the weird things that you want to do that, you can identify.
Yeah. And we actually have a use case that is relevant to both that risk that we just talked about and the next one we're going to talk about, which is that synthetic data is built on the past. Obviously, it has to use past data to train on. So it struggles
Hmm.
with what's new or what's different, similar to what you were just talking about. So
Hmm.
cultural shifts or emerging behavior or local nuance is very, very difficult for it to understand, and it basically can just disappear. So that's where that last 5%
Hmm.
in that Ernst& Young example matters, because that 5% is often the insight that you actually need to build your strategy on. It's those outliers that you were just talking about.
Yeah, a good real world example of this. There's a global bank that did traditional research in the Middle East and found that language choice really mattered far more than expected. So in the UAE, using English in certain campaigns actually reduced engagement. Switching to Arabic made a measurable difference. That's not a generic insight, that's local cultural context. So really that only comes from talking to real people in a specific market, not from pattern matching on historical data, for example.
And that's something that might seem really obvious. Like, obviously, using local language in a local territory
Hmm.
is going to make people engage with it more. But I think when you're looking at it from that synthetic data perspective, when it's using data that has been trained on English speaking countries, it can miss that nuance. That's
Hmm.
where it starts to get really interesting with some of the sovereign AIs, like the Swiss one,
Hmm.
that's been trained on local data there, because then you can start to pick up the cultural nuances that you perhaps wouldn't get with something like OpenAI, which doesn't have that.
Hmm.
Anyway, I could talk about that all day
Yeah.
long, but if you only run a synthetic survey, you'd probably get these very sensible global best practice answers, like what we were just
Hmm.
talking about, and that
Hmm.
really completely misses the thing that is going to make the biggest difference and the thing that you can actually build your strategy on. So synthetic respondents can be useful, but there are real methodological, did I say that right? Ethical
Yeah.
and practical risks if you over rely on them.
So the guidance is basically use synthetic data to explore and narrow options, but don't treat it as a substitute for real world contact. So it's great for directional exploration. Again, we keep using this directional, right? You don't need it to be completely accurate, but directionally correct. But it's not a clean replacement for actually engaging with humans in the real world, especially if you're trying to do something novel, right?
Yeah. I think if you think of it like we talked last week about one of the use cases for AI video content, and one of the use cases that I thought was interesting, because I'm not a huge fan of AI video, is using it for A/B testing. And it can
Mm-hmm.
at least give you an idea of the direction to go in or
Yeah.
what's going to perform better. And I think if you think of it in that same way, so think of it like an A/B test, or at least to give you some guidance if you've got two ideas and you aren't sure about one,
Hmm.
run it by a synthetic respondent, see what the general response is, and then you can focus more on one over the other. So that's the easiest way to think of it.
Hmm.
If you are a founder who is listening to this, you're probably thinking, okay, this is all great, but what can I actually do with this? And so we've got some guardrails to help you use synthetic datasets or synthetic respondents in a responsible way.
Yeah. So rule one, don't mix up the two types. Synthetic data sets for privacy and testing are different than synthetic respondents for market research. One is about safe testing environments, very useful. The other is about predicting human behavior, very different, both useful in their own rights.
Rule two, and this is a really big one. If a vendor, synthetic data vendor, comes to you and says, this is 95% accurate, your follow-up question has to be accurate against which real data set? So how recent is it? How similar to your actual market? Because that product market fit's really important. This is the governance question that regulators are pushing in other industries as well.
Some other ones I would add is, how do you measure privacy risk and leakage? These are questions to ask or take the vendor through. How do you measure privacy risk and leakage? Can you show me use cases where synthetic misled someone? So you're really trying to get their error or exception handling. Yeah. And then maybe push them on what's the workflow you recommend. Try to basically drill or dive into their workflows.
Rule number 3, use it to narrow choices, not make it. Just like we were talking about with the A/B testing, synthetic can help you explore multiple different directions in a day, but humans, that's you make the actual choice.
Rule 4, treat the synthetic data as hypothesis generation, right? You're not necessarily trying to get the exact answer. It's, again, that directional ideas. It's for what should we test, not what is true, right? That framing shows up repeatedly in research industry guidance.
And I will add a founder-specific one. If you haven't done customer discovery yet, synthetic is not your first step. It's not a substitute for knowing your customer. That is really, really, really important.
Yeah, I think synthetic respondents are really dangerous when you don't yet know what you don't know, right? It's not going to find that completely missing gap and come up with something novel. And I would say that this is where founders typically start or live. So, be aware of its shortcomings.
Yeah. So here's where synthetic data is great for founders. You can use it to explore quickly, and then you can validate with real humans before you do anything that you can't undo. So synthetic helps with the thing that founders struggle the most with, which is generating options without spending a fortune. Because we all know that if you're founding something, it's unlikely that you've got a lot of spare cash lying around.
Absolutely. So in practice, the sensible use cases are pretty grounded. Things like pricing sensitivity as a rough directional input, not exactly what we should charge, but, are we wildly off? So coming up with a range of pricing. Or testing a few different messaging angles to see which ones make sense or which avenue you should explore further.
Pricing is definitely one we can talk to Lee about. I believe he did this for his marketing course. He worked with synthetic data for pricing. Another one could be objection handling. So you can ask synthetic respondents what would stop you from buying this and get a decent sense of the types of concerns that you might hear. So even if you still need real customers to validate and tell you which ones matter, again, it points you in the right direction.
Absolutely. I really like this one. Early segmentation is a great, first use case. So this is our final ICP being ideal customer profile, but this isn't our final customer, but here are 2 or 3 distinct groups that we should be thinking about differently that maybe we want to do some messaging testing with afterwards.
Yeah. So in that sort of example, a practical workflow might look like you run 5 scenarios through synthetic in a day. You've got different prices, different audiences, different positioning. You pick the 2 that looks most promising, and then you talk to real customers about those. So again, it just gives you some guidance on which direction you should be looking in when you've got a myriad of choices.
Yeah. Your real research is tighter because you've already filtered out the garbage. You've removed those 25 potential options. And then when we say you're asking customers, that's obviously putting that out into the world through digital channels and whatnot. But when you do that, you're not asking customers about things that were never going to work anyway. You're really then fine tuning that specific messaging that's going to, work for mass market or for you to scale.
So if you boil it down, you're basically buying speed to better questions, not certainty, which is super valuable in its own right, to be honest.
Which I think is especially useful if you're a small team. And so every interview or survey actually costs you time and money.
And so that is what we will look at with Lee next week, which is moving from the what is this? What is synthetic data? To how do you actually use it
Hmm.
responsibly? Because Lee's got a lot of experience in that space.
Absolutely.
So, for AI news this week, we've got a few stories that are pointing to a similar pattern. I think this is really interesting because we talked a little bit about this last week in the video generation episode.
Hmm.
And the general theme that is going to be running through some of this is pushback against AI, not from a regulation perspective, but from a cultural and institutional perspective. So, San Diego Comic Con has recently updated its rules to ban AI generated art from its official art show.
Which is a pretty big deal
Yeah.
because if you know anything about San Diego Comic Con, it's one of the biggest cultural hubs in entertainment. I've been down there quite
I
a
was
few
going to say,
times,
yeah,
and
you've been quite a lot. I've been to London Comic Con, never San Diego.
I mean, it is chaos. It is a big deal. And I mean, it's like the Super Bowl if you're really into, anything nerdy and entertainment. But it covers everything from comics to movies in Hall H, which is
Yep.
famous, games, fandom. And, when we say fandom, like a lot of things that people produce themselves as part
Yep.
of or attached to a lot of this IP. So until now, they'd allowed AI art as long as it was labeled. And I think this is an important part. It was not for sale, so it wasn't commercially viable.
Yeah. And obviously, understandably, the artists hated that. There has been a growing backlash for a while, but this year it's really boiled over. So when Comic Con published its updated art rules and still allowed AI imagery, the artists and fans went hard on social media and they were not happy.
One of the more vocal critics was Carla Ortiz. She's worked with major studios that attend Comic Con. A lot of studios will go and actually talk about their movies. I mean, it's big for like DC and Marvel and stuff like that. And she basically said letting AI art sit next to human made art was disrespectful to artists who'd put in real effort. I kind of see her point. I'm
I
just saying.
absolutely see her point,
Yeah.
100%. And Comic Con did as well, because less than a day after the rules were posted, they
Hmm.
reversed course. So the new rule is very clear. Art created partially, which is interesting, or
Hmm.
wholly by AI is not allowed in the art show.
And related to this, we're starting to see a similar thing in music. So, Bandcamp, which is one of the few platforms still trusted by indie musicians, announced it's banning music generated wholly or substantially by AI. That leaves a little bit of guesswork there, but at least they're trying.
Yeah, so we know that Spotify has removed millions of AI generated tracks. It's something that we covered a couple months ago, particularly when it comes to spam or fake artists or unauthorized voice clones. And they've strengthened their policies to protect artists and combat algorithm gaming, but
Mhm.
they've not fully banned AI generated music wholesale.
So, culturally, it's a really interesting pushback that we're seeing from creatives. They don't want AI mixed in by default, even if it's labeled. And we've seen some examples of this where it's really becoming bifurcated of like, okay, here's AI and here's, AI. So I think why this is important is people are becoming much less comfortable with the idea that AI should just be everywhere by default.
Yeah, it actually comes back to some of the things that we talked about with Rich the other week in our bubble episode. I think the next phase of AI looks much more like boundaries and accountabilities and choosing where AI doesn't belong, not just where
Mhm.
it does, because it doesn't need to be crammed into every available space. Moving on to AI gone wrong. This one did make me laugh. I'm not going to lie, but I think it's exactly what's wrong with the current moment.
Yeah, this is a good one. So, the Economic Times, the second most widely read English language newspaper in the world, is doing a word of the day feature. And as you might imagine, they're using AI to generate the illustrations.
So that is already a choice. But in this particular instance, they picked the word Kafkaesque as their word of the
Mm,
day, and they had an AI generate an image of the word written on a blackboard.
mm. And of course, the AI spelled it Kafkaesque.
Do you want
Uh,
to spell that?
no, we don't need to. Just know that it was completely wrong and they mangled it. And anyone who's tried to use ChatGPT to create an image knows that it's not good for text.
Yeah, I mean, the word Kafkaesque, which literally means surreal and illogical and impossible to navigate, was illustrated with an image that was surreal and illogical and impossible to read. So really, it was actually fitting. I would say they would
Yeah.
do it intentionally, except we know that
Yeah.
they didn't.
It's almost too perfect, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
it's just very, very meta. I think the best part is it's still there. So they haven't taken it down. The image is labeled as AI generated and they just left it up.
At least they labeled it as AI generated.
Yeah.
But the best part is it's not even a one-off because they do this word of the day thing constantly. Like they publish sometimes 3 on the same day. And there have been other examples where this exact same thing has happened. So there was one where the word was pensive and the AI generated an image of a coffee cup labeled CELFFEE. Kelfie?
I love my Kelfie in the morning.
I love my Kelfie in the morning. Kyle, we know you can't function without Kelfie.
Bro, you don't even know. So yeah, I mean, look, we've talked and laughed about how AI can't spell. Although maybe they should switch over to Nano Banana.
I was
right?
gonna
That's
say they're
supposed to be a lot
clearly
better.
not using Nano Banana.
Yeah, they need to upgrade their tool stack.
Yeah.
But I mean, also they should be, I don't know if they're just not catching it or they just don't care. Maybe they've built in an automated workflow. Who knows? But
well, I think that's
that's
the real story, right? Like they clearly weren't using any tool that's good for generating a text. But the big concern is the fact that they are not having anyone check it. And that's a pretty easy thing to check. The bigger problem is that they're just not building in any quality control because quality control costs time and money. And we know that news publishers at the minute are strapped for both time and money. So in this instance, it's basically a race to the bottom where they're just pumping out content and hoping that nobody notices.
Yeah. And it's, it's unfortunate because the Economic Times is a real publication. We were saying the second largest. So it's not some spam site and it's not just, something you should be pumping out AI slop with.
Unfortunately, they are being crushed by a flood of AI slop on the internet. So they are basically just adding to the flood of AI slop on the internet, and it gets worse for everyone.
Absolutely.
Right. So that is what we've got this week on synthetic data. The biggest takeaway is that it's a tool. And like any tool, it's incredibly useful in the right hands and potentially an issue in the wrong ones.
And synthetic data doesn't buy you certainty. That's an important, distinction we want to make here. It buys you speed to better experiments. So think of it as, accelerant. But if you found this episode useful, please share it with someone who's been hearing about synthetic data or you think needs to start getting into synthetic data.
And if you've got thoughts or you have a story about synthetic data that you want to tell us about, make sure to get in touch. We're at hello@earlyadopter.ai or at early_adopter on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, YouTube, basically everywhere. Remember, there's no E in adopter. That's it.
So thanks for listening with us. And we'll be back next week with Lee Henshaw. I'm super excited about that.
Me too. See you next week.
Bye, Jess.
Bye.